Well, good morning. Let's get a little excited today. I'm very excited because while I live in California, I'm a good old Texas boy. Born and raised in this neighborhood of Highland Hills. That's where you at. I love it. But before I begin, you probably saw me wobble on the stage. And I want to say 50 is not the new 30. Donovan here asked me, what Taj, what happened? And in my mind, I wanted to say I was playing some soccer, I was on the court. But in reality, I just woke up. And my knee did not. But there's a blessing in getting older. There's a blessing in ailments. And there's going to be a blessing in these conversations that we're going to have today. Firstly, before I even begin, I want to give a great shout out to this fine university of Paul Quinn College. I want to thank Mr. Maurice West. I want to thank President Sorrell. And if you notice why I singled those two men out, because those two gentlemen are also members of the greatest fraternity ever made, which I'm a member of as well, called Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Do not forget it. So I definitely want to give a shout out to them. And the reason for that is that, again, remember, I said I'm from Texas. What is our sport of this state? Football. This university no longer has a football field because they changed it into a community garden. Now, either that takes a lot of forethought in regenerative agriculture or economics, or either a lot of wishing that the Cowboys did better, but they did it. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm so proud that we're having these conversations on this campus and what we're doing. One of the things I love that Donovan mentioned, he talked about regenerative economics. What a lot of people don't realize is that I went to school here in Texas for undergrad. I went to East Texas State. How many people have heard of East Texas State? In Commerce, Texas. My major was poetry and literature because I used to want to be a rapper. And my parents said, you're not, you're going to college. I said, that's so you. I'll be a poetry and literature major. So needless to say, I did not end up producing an album, but I did go into business. I got my MBA from Pepperdine. I got a PhD actually in economics from Claremont. And so when I think about regenerative economics, I kind of think about what I remember from school. And if you give me a moment, I'll read it. Regenerative economics means moving away from extractive businesses and unlocking the potential for positive contributions for nature and society. A regenerative economy seeks to have balance, efficiency, resilience, collaboration, competition, diversity, coherence, and small, medium, and large organizations and needs. All those things really kind of come into this capitalistic society that we tend to forget. A lot of times we feel like we have to have sacrifices when we think about impact, when we think about social justice or impact investment. One of the things I want to tell you is that when I first got into venture capital, I did not put impact investing on this side and traditional investing on this side. Every investment you make has an impact. Some are positive, some are negative. So if we look at it from that way, every investor is an impact investor, whether you're doing real estate, venture capital, private equity. We have to realize that our investments are impactful. And that means not only to the market, but out to our society. One of the things I want to talk about is how many in this room have heard the term BIPOC? BIPOC. I want to be very transparent with you and say that I detest that term. 3 reasons. The BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, people of color. And when I hear that term, the first thing I tell people is that, let me see your eyes. What are you talking about, Dr. Eldridge? I stands for Indigenous. We are on the land right now of the Caddo, of the Wichita, and the Comanche. But we never hear those indigenous voices in conversations about sustainability. They've been here far longer than all of us, and about ways to manage our land and capital. One thing I will say, though, for this conference, you're in luck because you have Vanessa Roanhorse tomorrow, so please go see her. But I wanted to make sure that we're talking about these issues because if we're talking about this idea of regenerative economics, regenerative society, regenerative agriculture, we have to look at the people who've been here before and how they managed that land and been good stewards of this land as well. When we first began, we talked about, and the great MC mentioned Include Ventures, which is my firm. And I typically say I wear two hats, both literally and figuratively. The first hat is Include Ventures. That is a $250 million fund of funds and investment vehicle. We invest in other venture funds, and we invest in direct companies in the areas of clean tech, fintech, digital media, health, and future of work. In addition, I lead a $25 million project with the Ares Charitable Foundation from Ares Management Capital, the $500 billion firm, and Jobs for the Future. Jobs for the Future is a Boston-based firm that focuses on the future of work. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But the reason that I really kind of come into this to talk about it is that, I want to mention a word that sometimes is divisive, but I wanted us to get away from the divisiveness of it and think about it from a capitalistic standpoint. Climate change. For me, climate change isn't a science that I'm interested in. I remember I told you I'm an economist first and foremost, and then I was a poet before that. And I never was a person that got into it. And quite frankly, when I left Texas and went to California, when I would hear environmentalists and people talk, I would say some of the terms I've heard growing up. Tree hugger. The list can go on and on, right? And I never really thought about it until something happened. I got sick. 2018, I got diagnosed with a kidney disease. Two of my cousins have passed away since of this same disease from here in Dallas. When they passed away, what they said was kidney failure, but they were 20 and 30. I'm nearing 50. I got diagnosed nearly 5 years ago. But I had the luck of being at a university. At the time, I was working for the University of California, and we did some genetic testing. We found out that disease called FSGS came from the groundwater in the great state of Texas, in Dallas, Texas. So when Esther talks about agrochemicals, when she talks about this idea of sustainability and the way we do our soil, there are unintended consequences, and maybe for some intended consequences that we have to think about. And that's the same thing for capitalism, right? Because I think at the end of the day, when the pandemic happened, it didn't matter how your portfolio was doing. It didn't matter what type of capital you were bringing in. Everything stopped. So there are consequences to our actions that we take from an environmental standpoint. And for me, that's when I think about regenerative economics. I think about how the environment impacts the way we make money and how we can make money as well. So kind of going back to this idea of the kidney failure. I got diagnosed in 2018, been on dialysis since that time. If anybody knows anyone that's on dialysis or been in dialysis, it's a horrible disease, horrible experience. However, what I loved about it is that I go to dialysis 4 o'clock in the morning. I'll be going tomorrow here in Dallas. But at the time, we were talking and making investments abroad, and we probably made investments in 3 companies in Europe while I was in the dialysis chair. So there's a silver lining to that. But the reason I mention that is, for me, climate change, this idea of climate change itself, is less have to do with how much time we have on this earth. But for me, it's a public health issue. I just gave you one. And when I think about climate change, I only think about environmental change as well. So you think about people who may have asthma, who may live next to off-ramps. And all of us are at home. A lot of people are at home and getting their goods and services delivered to them. The vehicles they're having greenhouse gas emissions, I should say. And they're being impacted. People with eczema. People here in Texas might have heat stroke because we have extreme weather. So those are the things I think about when I think about climate change, is this idea of public health. The second piece of climate change is about social impact. A lot of the people who are adversely impacted by climate are the ones least providing the emissions. Those are poor communities. Those are communities of immigrants. And I think the thing we have to think about is that trumps this idea of black and white, man and woman. because there are poor white communities, poor black communities, poor brown communities, and the like. So every American is being touched and being impacted by it. But lastly, what I want to talk about today, I know we had a good kind of lead up, is for me, climate justice or climate change is an economic opportunity. We have an opportunity to build what I call green wealth on the backs of dirty debt. The whole world is making this transition to this idea of clean energy. Europe far more faster than us here in the United States. And for me, instead of calling the people who believe in the tree huggers, what I said is I'm going to make money with the tree huggers. And the idea, I think, is that you have to make sure that as the transition is happening, that you have an opportunity to be part of that transition, and those communities are part of that transition. And I'll give you a perfect example. You know, the car that dropped me off here today was an electric vehicle. And one of the first questions he asked me was the charging facilities here in the university. And one of the things we talked about it was that how difficult it was for him to have charging infrastructure. And what I said was, it sounds like John D. Rockefeller in the early time of this country, to where he thought about Standard Oil and how oil was going to be driving the economy of his lifetime with the vehicles. We're in that same space. And we need to find out who are the next John D. Rockefellers of our transition, who are going to be the ones who are going to put the charging stations in these facilities, who are going to be helping with that whole space of it as well. But for me, climate change and clean tech, green tech, the whole nine, is more than just about electric vehicles. It's more than just about solar. It's even what's on our body. I begin, and people see me a lot with these hats, but the hats I wear are from a company called one company called NTTE, another company called Apache Hat Company, again, the indigenous company that I mentioned that we look for. And both of those organizations make hats out of waste. The reason that's important is because China is no longer going to take our waste as Americans. And so that also impacts us from a climate and environmental standpoint that we have to think about. Some may saw when I first walked up these lovely shoes, I step out, that kind of look weird, but Louis Vuitton is not weird. But I would tell you though, they're also made by waste, right? And the whole idea is climate change, environmentalism, is this idea of really kind of thinking about sustainability and how can we make our project and our governance better with sustainability as well. And so that's one of the things we need to think about. So I mentioned green wealth and dirty debt, and I mentioned include ventures where we've been making investments into climate funds and companies. We made 10 investments this past April into 10 different climate funds, and we're making another 4 this month into them. But remember, I mentioned I'm working on another project as well called with the Aries Foundation and Jobs for the Future called CREST. CREST stands for Climate Resilient Employees for a Sustainable Tomorrow. The $500 billion fund said, this is important to us, so let's give a bit of capital, $25 million. And the whole idea for Utah is what we want you to do is do two things. We want you to create 25,000 jobs in the area of climate resilience, and we want to make sure 100,000 people know about these new jobs. So I said, great. Who do we want to give this money to? So it's 3 stakeholders that we want to work with: universities, community colleges, and cities and organizations, NGOs. And the whole idea is that we believe that the future of work for this idea as the whole world takes this climate transition is more than people with PhDs like me. It's more than people with bachelor's degrees even. I'm a proud graduate of Dallas Community College, in addition to East Texas State. And I think there are some very smart people who have gone to our community colleges here and other places in this country as well. They should also be part of this economy and this idea. So we're providing capital to those institutions to do so and train. In addition to that, and there are some organizations out there as well that believe in this idea of earn and learn, meaning that college may not be for everyone who's going to participate in this economy, but they need to have a pathway to it. And so when we see organizations that create these opportunities for earn and learn, which means paid apprenticeships, I think those are going to be some really interesting things in the future as well. We have a few that we've invested in. One called Charger Help, that's based in LA, California, that trains individuals to get into the next stage of charging station repair. as more people and more states make bans on gas vehicles, we need to make sure the infrastructure is there. So they're literally training the next generation of auto mechanics, because these are computers on wheels, and they're training the next generation of gas station owners, because the next gas station of the future is going to be electric. And so that's the whole point of CREST, is to make sure that we're preparing what the future economy is. The talk today was supposed to be about, Taj, what are the future economies? And I can tell you that the future economy is going to be looking at climate change differently than we all are. And the question for us is that, do we sit here and do we want to debate what it is? Or do we want to make sure that we're participating in this economy and make sure that we have an aspect in it as well? And so I think when we talk up to the breakout room later on in the day, we'll talk a little bit more about CREST and the things that we want to do. But I wanted to leave everyone with this and just really kind of think about climate change is three things. It is a public health issue, it is a social justice issue, and it's an economic issue for us to make sure that we're a part of. So I'll pause there, and I'm more of a conversationalist. I couldn't see the screen. I have seasoned eyes, so I'm like, I'm not gonna have any slides, but I wanted to make sure we have a conversation here, and pause and see if you have any questions. I can't be the only one that wants to make money. Let's go. Okay, let's go. What's your question?
Us, or should we also be looking at advocacy at state and other levels?
Yes. You're talking about as far as solving the climate crisis?
Yes.
The climate crisis can be solved in a silo, meaning that it can't be on our backs as citizens to solve it. It has to be a collab. Remember when I began with the definition of regenerative economics, one word I said is collaborative. We tend to forget that. So it can't just be the citizens, but it also can't be just the corporations. It can't just be our politicians. It can't just be our education institutions. It has to be all of us. And so I think that's how I look at it. And I think that's the way we have to do it if we're going to do it. But to that point, there has to, I'm an economist, remember, so there has to be incentive. So we have to be incentivized. And the incentive for us as individuals is the opportunity to build green wealth. The incentive for companies is the opportunities to have people shop of them. Give you a perfect example. How many have heard of this? I don't even know if it's here, but how many have heard of the store Kohl's? Kohls. Kohl's is a store ubiquitous in California, but also in the Midwest. When you go into Kohl's, they have these signs that says, these clothes are sustainably sourced. The suit that I have on comes from a sustainable source company that uses low water to make cotton. I told you about the shoes, it's made from waste, and the hat as well. And that's the way that corporations can really kind of help. And it's a hand-in-hand process, right? The other point about that is if anybody has ever booked a flight on Google Flight, you'll see it lists those flights based on emissions. And they'll say this flight has 17% emissions and so forth and so on. And I think one of the things we're seeing is until those flights are cheaper because of those emissions, the incentives are not going to change. So you got to have dual incentives, both for politicians, people, and corporations. Thank you for your question.